gospel we preach must apply to every area of life that has been fouled by sin and its effects. The church and individual Christian evangelists must preach the biblical gospel of comprehensive redemption, not just personal soul winning. Wherever sin reigns, there the gospel must be at work, transforming and restoring.
Hi, and welcome to the Devoted Word. I'm Joel McDermott, brought to you by the American Vision. Visit us at americanvision.org. We've been covering Genesis 1, 2, and 3 over the past couple of sessions. I think we'll have a couple more, this one included. And today I want to cover one more, really two more, but mostly one more aspect of God as a personal God and the biblical worldview set apart over against others. And that is God, we'll touch on God as the owner of creation, a very important concept when it comes to economics and our roles there. And we'll also talk about God as a revealing God. We've talked about God in the last session as God as a personal God, that He is a person, that He is a person and three persons. That designates society, the perfect society, and sets the model, if you will, for all of human societies, whether it's marriage, whether it's family, of course, churches, civil governments, voluntary societies of all sort. The whole concept of social theory will go back to the doctrine of the Trinity, and that's found and seen right here in these first three verses in the Bible. Again, more on that later at different times. Just now getting the concept across. Today, one of the important aspects of God that pertains to Him as a personal God, but also as the creator-creation distinction, is God as a revealing God. And I wanted to share with you a couple passages from the philosopher, actually apologist, theologian, whatever you want to call him, Cornelius Van Til. And these are important for more than one reason. Usually Van Til is very difficult to read. A lot of people think he's completely inaccessible. He was Dutch, from a Dutch background anyway. I'm not sure if he was, I don't think he was immigrant, but he certainly spoke Dutch and read Dutch, and a lot of people think that when he wrote his books in English, he was still thinking in Dutch as he wrote in English. And it does come across very turgid in places. However, there are some very accessible passages. There are also, he was also very gifted at using metaphors to describe different aspects of his teaching. And in fact, someone's compiled a list of those somewhere that maybe we'll go through at some point. I think it would be very helpful. However, today I want to read a couple of the more accessible passages, I think, that are more helpful in getting some of these ideas across. Now, in terms of God as a revealing God, we talked already about God as His revelation in nature to all men, and God as His special revelation, which exhibits His truth to those who believe, and also shows the way of redemption. This first passage is a well-known one in many Reformed circles, and it has to do with how God has revealed Himself just in the fact of creation. Again, remember, we're talking about Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And how does this bear on worldview? We're seeing it bear on worldview in every way you can imagine, because it's the beginning of everything, right? Of course. So it bears on personality. It bears on reality. It bears on metaphysics. What is the ultimate reality? It bears on physics and science. And this, as you will see, has a direct relationship to how we do science, or how we understand science. So this is from chapter 1 of his book, A Survey of Christian Epistemology. I know, page turner, right? And, well, it actually is. Chapter 1, after the introduction, he talks about terminology. And he begins that very first page, page 1 in the book, talking about revelation. Here's what he says. According to Scripture, God has created the universe. So you see Genesis 1:1 there, right? Clear. God has created time and space. God has created all the facts of science. All right, now we may have already discussed this a little bit, but just stop right there and consider what Van Til's saying. We're talking in terms of science now. When you think of scientists doing scientific experiments, and as we said the other day, we observe, we make hypotheses, we test those hypotheses, we draw up experiments so that others can verify the results of our experiments and test our hypotheses. And from that, we eventually lead to what we call scientific theories, which is kind of a body of scientific knowledge. That whole process is dependent upon a particular set of assumptions about the creation itself, that it is objective, that we can know it, that what we know is actually objective and can be repeated, that it is predictable. And Van Til's point here is that Genesis is telling us up front that not only, as we've said already, every single quark and atom and every star and constellation and every for the furthest reaches of the universe, everything in it was created by God and bears his stamp saying mine. Every fact, Van Til says, every fact of science was created by him. So that it's not just the things in themselves, but their existence as an objective environment in which we can relate to them. We know them. Again, go back to the last lesson. Christ upholding all things by the word of his power, that there is a sustaining force here that is according to his word. So God has created all the facts of science. Every single fact is in its place. Every observation made by a scientist that goes into the experiment, or that maybe sometimes gets left out of the experiment, who knows? Sometimes they do on purpose. Every one of those facts was put there by God as part of his creation. Not a sparrow falls to the ground. Not a single hair goes unnumbered. All of that stuff. God then, on top of this, God has created the human mind. Okay, we're starting to see a pattern here. Of course, we know these things at the base level, but we're putting them in logical order to develop this argument. God has created the facts. God has created the human mind. God has created the light, the whole process in which they work together. In this human mind, God has laid the laws of thought according to which it is to operate. In the facts of science, God has laid the laws of being according to which they function. In other words, the impress of God's plan is upon his whole creation. We may characterize this whole situation by saying that the creation of God is a revelation of God. God revealed himself in nature, and God also revealed himself in the mind of man. Thus it is impossible for the mind of man to function except in an atmosphere of revelation. And every thought of man, when it functioned normally in this atmosphere of revelation, would express the truth as laid in the creation by God. So, and he goes on to say, we may therefore call a Christian epistemology a revelational epistemology. Okay, for terminology, that's good. What is Van Til saying here? That every bit of it is part of God's creation, but that also, and we can draw in future more theology with this, he has put his image within us. The laws of thought by which we operate is his creation. The laws of nature which science recognizes and observes, he has created. He has created all the facts. He has created all the laws by which those facts operate, so that we know that when we stand on this earth, which is of a particular size, and we throw a ball up in the air, it's going to accelerate according to a certain thing, but it's going to decelerate according to gravity and fall back to the earth, and we can measure that, and we can repeat it, and we can use that knowledge for different things, and this becomes the basis not gravity itself, but this set of circumstances allows us to have a scientific method. And that becomes the basis for all of the science we do, whether it is simple physics or relativity, Einsteinian level physics, whatever the proper term for that may be, astronomy, all of the science that we do in terms of biology, zoology, minerals, rocks, geology, every branch of the physical and hard sciences are all absolutely dependent upon everything that was said in these two paragraphs right here. And that all, of course, is dependent upon Genesis 1. So what we're trying to get across here is that the universe in which all of these things operate is from God, without the presuppositions that are given here, that there is this eternal God, that he is all-powerful, that he is sovereign over the creation, that he is distinct from it, and that the creation operates according to laws he created and sustains, that he has created the mind of man to operate according to certain laws in that environment in such a way that it is understandable, reasonable, predictable, etc., so that we can have a scientific method without those basic assumptions being made, and we call them presuppositions, that it does not make sense. For example, and we can take this to various different conclusions. If we don't have those there, then there is no basis for science except some other hypothesis that has to ultimately look exactly like the God of the Bible. This is the basis of the transcendental argument, as it's called, the transcendental argument for the existence of God. It is that without him, nothing else makes sense, ultimately. And if you take any fact of the universe and reason from that fact to its logical conclusions, you will either end up with some arbitrary authority trying to impose meaning upon it, which essentially is where Nietzsche and postmodernism eventually go, and or you'll have some version of like Hinduism, in which there's this ultimate realm where everything is meaning on the spiritual level, but that is to say everything and to say nothing, and something that is spiritual will sound like a proverb, like, you're just a drop of water falling into the ocean, and it's only when you realize that you lose your identity and become part of the ocean that you actually find yourself, or some variation of that. And in that worldview, all of the diversity you have in your experience, whether it's color or touch or the facts of science, all of them you have to say is ultimately an illusion of some sort. So people have built other ideas upon this, and when you look at history, the vast majority of actual science and progress has been done in Christian-dominated societies. In societies, it's not so much saying, I believe in Jesus, I'm born again, that's done this. It's been societies who took the presuppositions of the Bible and developed from that worldviews in which science flourishes. And so all of the great scientific discoveries, historically speaking, with exception of some, come out of that worldview in the West. And even the ones that are being made today by leaps and bounds are building on the same capital, even if the people making them are sometimes atheists. So that's kind of an apologetic argument that we can get into later. Scripture so often tells us this, and in such simple, profound ways, again, as Scripture often does, very simple ways, but in ways that are they're artistic in such a way that it's almost hyperbole. Psalm 19 is one of the famous ones. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and all of that. That the heavens and the earth. I'm butchering the quote because I should have had it marked. That declare His handiwork and declare His glory. And of course, here I sit unprepared, right? That's why this is such a casual podcast. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above, or the firmament, proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech. Night to night reveals knowledge. Do we think of creation as a revelation of him? We ought to. And in fact, it's almost like it's screaming at us that it's not just screaming at us that he exists, but that he is glorious. The heavens declare the glory of God. Day to day pours out speech. Night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, like a strong man runs his course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them. There is nothing hidden from its heat. So, there's this rich poetry here between light and warmth. Again, going back to those nurturing images of Genesis 1, right? But also, that is interplaying with the bare fact of the sun traversing the earth. Nothing can escape its heat. And especially if you live in the American South, the air conditioning doesn't help you much either. But nothing escapes the heat of the sun. And so there's kind of this material view of it that there's a very realistic. There's also a metaphorical, spiritual view of it in which he's talking about light and warmth. And all of this, he's saying, declares God. It's pouring out speech. It's like it's nonstop. It's like you have Fox News. Terrible analogy. Forgive me. It's like you have a news station on and it's just pouring forth information constantly. Only unlike Fox News and the propaganda, or CNN, or whatever one you listen to, the propaganda that comes from their particular spin, this is coming from God himself, revealing himself through the creation. So that when you get to Romans, of course, the famous passage in Romans 1 is that everyone knows him. There is no escape. Okay, this is the ultimate criticism of evidentialist apologetics that says, if we just show them enough evidence and eventually we'll be able to convince them that God exists, that we can walk them from point A, a little bit more evidence, point B, a little bit more, point C. That misses the whole point. Romans 1 says specifically they do not need more evidence. It's right there. It's screaming at you. It is in your face. And the problem is not that you don't have evidence. The problem is that you are suppressing the evidence that is before your face, and in fact is being poured out to you constantly. So keep all of that in mind, but the bare fact is here that we live in a world that is revelational. In fact, every fact of the universe, every fact of science speaks of creation being a creation, and therefore of the God who created it. So we cannot escape him no matter where we go in nature. So there's that. But then there's also the fact of what happens when, because remember in that quotation, Van Til says, if the mind of man, when it's working properly, and he's speaking in that paragraph, when he says working properly, he means before the fall. So what happens to the mind of man when the fall comes? Well, you just heard it from Romans 1. It now is in rebellion against its creator. Mankind's basic problem is not one of knowledge so much as it is ethics. He is rebelling. He is wanting to be his own God. He is wanting to take the place of God and dethrone God from the universe. And so that is what Van Til says, how the mind would work properly is before the fall. Now, here's another passage from Van Til. This one's a little lengthier, so forgive me for that. But I think this is fabulous. And it talks about what happens when fallen man follows his own reason in looking at the creation and trying to determine what are the sources of what we're seeing, or what is reasoning from any particular fact from its own vantage point, trying to decipher what is reality, what is ultimate reality, what are the bases of science, what is the basis of morality. Of course, we covered some of that in the last talk, I believe, when we talked about the Marquis de Sade and the authority of nature and all of that. What Van Til is trying to show us here is if we only follow our way of doing things, we're going to run into very clear limitations. Why? Because the creation, us, is not the creator. We don't have his vantage point, and we need his revelation. We need his sustaining of all things in order for all of it to work properly. In other words, we need to recognize we are dependent. And when we don't, we run into various problems in our science, in all of our worldview. So I'll discuss that in just a minute. But basically, the distinction Van Til is making here in terms of revelation also then applies to what we take as the authoritative revelation in our lives. Is it our own experience? Is it the experience of other people, experts or elites? Is it the experience of a collective of people? Or is it tradition, which is just another way of saying a collective of people, and or anything of that nature? And ultimately, Van Til's point is, at the bottom of it, you have to either see things God's way, or you're going to see things man's way. It might be your way, somebody else's. It's ultimately going to be man's way. And so he uses two terms for this. If you see it according to God's law, the design of God, it is theonomos, God's law, theonomy. We're using that term here in the very broad sense of the term, not the more narrow sense, which we will discuss later, that discusses whether we will apply certain aspects of Mosaic judicial law or not, and how that works, and what is the hermeneutics, what is the interpretation of Scripture, what are the principles used to determine that. But here we're just using it in the broad sense to mean God's way, God's design, God's law, God's order. And opposed to that is self-law, what I decide is right, whether it's my own or some other man's or some tradition of men's, whatever. And that is autos nomos in the Greek, autonomy, or we commonly say autonomy. So you have theonomy or autonomy. Those ultimately, in every area of life, are your choices. So what Van Til is telling us here is that for far too long, many people in not just the unbelieving world, but many Christians, and I would say the majority in history, have followed too much the worldviews of unbelieving man and have developed our own Christian worldviews as kind of Christianized or baptized versions of those. But in doing so, we pull their presuppositions into our study of Scripture and nature and everything else, and end up seeing the world in various ways that are just as pagan as the pagans. You can still see this today with references to natural law, laws in nature, as if it were of itself. You see this today certainly when it comes to Christian psychology or Christian counseling. Thankfully, certainly in the past decades, there's been a move to create a biblical counseling, and that creates its own set of problems, sometimes because it's in reaction. And all interpretation of Scripture ultimately requires a process of scholarship and arriving at the right interpretation. That's not to be denied. But the practice of taking what pagans invented and saying, oh, this is the intellectual avant-garde, and baptizing that with a few Scripture verses, and then basically doing the same thing the pagans are doing, has been a real problem in psychology, in science, in religion, even in the various branches and knowledge of scholarship. Education, certainly, in various other things. So what Van Til is trying to do here is say, back up, let us acknowledge what we're doing here according to the Bible and a theonomic view, that is a scriptural, biblical worldview, as opposed to what we've inherited from some various traditions. Because when we view revelation and the authority of revelation, the authority of our knowledge, from the autonomy perspective, whatever it may be, we're going to run into these problems. And here they are. I'm going to read a few paragraphs to you, so we'll take the next few minutes going through this. First, he says, there is a need for authority. Let me back up. He says, let us note then some of the forms of authority that are quite acceptable to the natural man, because to his mind they do not violate the principle of autonomy. First, there is the need for authority that grows out of the existence of the endless multiplicity of factual material. I mentioned this a while ago. Time rolls its ceaseless course. It pours out upon us an endless stream of facts. And the stream is really endless on the non-Christian basis. For those who do not believe that all that happens in time happens because of the plan of God, the activity of time is like to that, or rather is identical with that, of chance. Thus the ocean of facts has no bottom and no shore. It is this conception of the ultimacy of time and of pure factuality on which modern philosophy, particularly since the days of Kant, that's Immanuel Kant, has laid such great stress. And it is because of the general recognition of the ultimacy of chance that rationalism of the sort that Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz represented is out of date. Okay, so basically he's noting that there was a shift in humanistic philosophy from René Descartes and that era when we came to Immanuel Kant, and he began to notice some new things. And post-Kantian philosophy, as he'll go on to say, is what led us to where we are today. Led us to postmodernism, led us to pure relativism, and things of that nature. So he continues, it has become customary to speak of post-Kantian philosophy as irrationalistic. It has been said that Kant limited reason so as to make room for faith. Hence there are those who are willing to grant that man's emotions or his will can get in touch with such aspects of reality as are not accessible to the intellect. The intellect, it is said, is not the only, and in religious matters not even the primary, instrument with which men come into contact with what is ultimate in human experience. There is the world of the moral imperative, of aesthetic appreciation, of the religious a priori, as well as the world of science. There is, in short, the world of mystery, into which the prophet, or genius of feeling, or of will, may lead us. It is of the greatest import to note that the natural man need not in the least object to the kind of authority that is involved in the idea of irrationalism, and that chiefly for two reasons. In the first place, the irrationalism of our day is the direct lineal descendant of the rationalism of previous days. You've got to catch on to what he's saying here, that what we're experiencing today in terms of postmodernism, of relativism, of all of the various branches of that and the applications of that, if you think of the most radical forms of gender identity and transgenderism today, where people refuse to be called what they are, of insisting upon being called, in some cases wanting to pass laws to force people to call them what they are not. In other words, trying to legislate the utterly irrational. And we look at this and we say, what does the world come to? It's utterly irrational to call black white and white black, to call good evil and evil good, to call life death and death life, to call male female and female. These are the utter polarities of human existence, and the philosophies of this day have come to the point where they're wanting us to eliminate all of those distinctions and call them one, or not just call them one, call them the opposite of what they are. And Van Til is saying, look, don't think this is anything out of the ordinary for unbelieving thought and its presuppositions. The irrationalism we are experiencing today is nothing more than the logical outworking of the rationalism of a previous era. And that is hugely important. The rationalism of the Enlightenment, of that pre-Kantian era and of the Kantian era as well, gave us many things, and we probably need to do a show just on this in how not just feminism, but the reaction to it, actually what feminism was reacting to in terms of a very skewed masculinity, was not the product, as some people tell us today, of the church and the Bible, and somehow this kind of patriarchal view of the Bible. No, all of that came out of Roman society, but it was heightened by the Enlightenment and its fixation upon rational categories and clear distinctions in nature. And the insistence upon seeing things rationally ultimately led us to what we see as irrationalism today. And Van Til is trying to point us to a very clear fact, is that they are two sides of the same coin. It is the same thing. It is man's defiance of God, man's refusal to submit to God's law order and put everything in balance. Is not the right word, because it's not a matter of finding some middle ground in between these two extremes. That can be just as arbitrary as anything else. It is a matter of finding God's perfect design for things, and when you find that, balance comes naturally, and it may not come the way you think it should come, but it comes. So anyway, chiefly for two reasons. The first place, the irrationalism of our day is the direct lineal descendant of the rationalism of previous days. The idea of pure chance has been inherent in every form of non-Christian thought in the past. It is the only logical alternative to the position of Christianity, according to which the plan of God is back of all. In other words, when he says is back of all, he means is undergirding the whole thing. Christianity, according to which the plan of God is back of all. Both Plato and Aristotle were compelled to make room for it in their maturest thought. The pure, quote, non-being of the earliest rationalism of Greece was but the suppressed otherness of the final philosophy of Plato. So too, the idea of pure factuality, or pure chance as ultimate, is but the idea of otherness made explicit. Given the non-Christian assumption with respect to man's autonomy, the idea of chance has equal rights with the idea of logic. Now listen to where this goes. In the second place, modern irrationalism has not in the least encroached upon the domain of the intellect as the natural man thinks of it. Irrationalism has merely taken possession of that which the intellect, by its own admission, cannot in any case control. Irrationalism has a secret treaty with rationalism, by which the former cedes to the latter so much of its territory as the latter can at any time find the forces to control. Kant's realm of the noumenal, which was the realm of faith, as it were, agreed to yield so much of its area to the phenomenal, that is, the area of senses and science, as the intellect by its newest weapons can manage to keep in control. Moreover, by the same treaty, irrationalism has promised to keep out of its own territory any form of authority that might be objectionable to the autonomous intellect. Van Til's writing this in what, the 1960s? 50s, 1955. This comes out in 55. He's so far ahead of where the Christian world is going to be, of where the whole world is going to be, that he's seeing what we're dealing with right now. And you may have gotten lost in all the verbiage as I read it. There's a secret treaty between rationalism and irrationalism. Rationalism wants control. Okay? It wants to order all things by the mind of man. Think of rationalism as a dictator. Irrationalism is the other side of that coin, and it wants control where it cannot assert control through science or through government, through totalitarianism. It diffuses into chaos so that every individual is left with this realm of feelings or emotions or some excuse to duck out from under the control of God's order. And the reigning rationalist dictatorship will say, that's okay. In fact, I will provide cover for that through my rationalism, saying whatever attacks I can make upon the faith, basically creating space for the irrational to operate, because the irrational is the other side of my coin. It is the other side of me, so to speak, of autonomous human thought, of the rebellious man fighting against God. And so it says, I will pretend to have everything under control, and what I don't have under control, I will say, well, there's some kind of force out there science has not yet discovered yet, but what we do know is that Christianity is not true, and it will attack that, and it will create space and run interference for itself in its irrational form to act in chaos out there. So when you see chaos erupting in society, whether it's through the transgender problem or the LGBT agenda or whatever else is going on there, you can be sure that there is a counterpart to that in the part of society that's already received. And I'll be honest with you, in many cases, Christians are probably already complicit with this. Because as Van Til critiques Plato and Aristotle, keep in mind, for the longest time, Christian social thought was simply Platonism until the Middle Ages, when they brought Aristotle into the universities, and then Aquinas did the synthesis, and suddenly the whole of Western civilization is Aristotelian in social thought. Forgive me. So this problem goes on and on and on, and far too often Christians are right in the middle of it, instead of backing into the Bible and its worldview and creating our own biblical social order. Anyway, and that's just social order. It's all areas of life. So we have this problem, and Van Til has seen it clearly and called it out, what now, 63 years ago? This is amazing. The very idea of pure factuality or chance is the best guarantee that no true authority, such as that of God as the Creator, as judge of men, will ever confront man. If we compare the realm of the phenomenal, as it has been ordered by the autonomous intellect, to a clearing in a large forest, we may compare the realm of the noumenal to that part of the same forest which has not yet been laid under cultivation by the intellect. The realm of mystery is on its basis simply the realm of that which is not yet known, and the service of irrationalism to rationalism may be compared to that of some bold huntsman in the woods who keeps all lions and tigers away from the clearing. This bold huntsman covers the whole of the infinitely extended forest, ever keeping away all danger from the clearing. This irrationalistic Robin Hood is so much of a rationalist that he virtually makes a universal negative statement about what can happen in all future time. In other words, irrationalism is working in the meantime to provide cover where rationalism does not yet have control. And it says faith, God, God's law, God's order cannot operate here because we haven't quite figured it out yet. And rationalism says exactly the same thing. And if you try to come in with God's law order, irrationalism says, sorry, I don't feel good about that. You're making me feel bad. You're making me uncomfortable. Why are your thoughts authoritative over my thoughts? We're all equal here, right? And it comes up with every excuse in the book in order to shelter itself from the domain of God. But what's really happening is it's providing cover for the other half of the domain of man, because at some point it may say, well, okay, we've figured this out scientifically now. We can now push this part of the irrational ism into the rationalism and have control of that now. And then the dictates will come down from on high, from whoever the ruling elites may be at the time. It doesn't matter. It happens on the social level, but this happens also in you at the personal level. Probably need to do a whole show just on that. In the secret treaty spoken of, he has assured the intellect of the autonomous man that the God of Christianity cannot possibly exist, and that no man therefore need to fear the coming of a judgment. If the whole course of history is, at least in part, controlled by chance, then there is no danger that the autonomous man will ever meet with the claims of authority as the Protestant believes in it. For the notion of authority is but the expression of the idea that God by his counsel controls all things that happen in the course of history. I should probably just do a whole podcast reading through his book. It's fabulous. That is, by the way, that's The Defense of the Faith. This is, I believe, the 3rd edition. Interesting history on this book, by the way. Published originally in 1955. The 2nd edition was cut down to make it a little more accessible. 3rd edition repeated that. And now it's in a repeat of the 1st edition. Just recently, a few years back, Presbyterian and Reformed, I believe, published the original 1st edition in its extended format. So you can grab that. So what I just read to you was pages 124 through 126 of the 3rd edition. Those will be different pages if you have a 1st or the 4th edition. So just a little complication there. So what we see here, when man departs from the creator-creation distinction and a personal relationship with the God who is sovereign over all of it and upholds all things by the word of his power, we see what happens to his worldview. It has this bifurcation in it in which it's struggling between rational and irrational. And it does this, as I said, on a social level, on a worldview level, but also on a personal level. We do the same things when we're trying to order our own world and make a sense out of it. If something doesn't make sense to us, we don't, the natural man I'm speaking of, the fallen man, it will say, well, that's outside of my control, but it will never cease. It will never let God in to explain what's going on here. It will always be looking for a way to explain it in a way that I can control, that I'm in control of. When the Bible talks about pride and humility, this is really the fundamental part of what it's talking about. It is that part in which you're trying to maintain control through the narrative you've created for yourself in your head. That narrative may have some aspects to it that are true, but it probably has many that are false also. So if you're struggling with husband and wife relationships and there's an argument and everything she says to you sounds utterly irrational and everything you say to her makes perfect sense in your head, but what she's saying back to you is, you just don't get it. You're not getting it. You're not listening to me. And you've fully got this thought out in your head. You know it makes perfect sense. Guess what? It probably actually doesn't. It probably only makes sense to you because you're being selfish, or vice versa, or some combination of both of those. That's when the relational element comes in as well. What's going on here is that same divide that Van Til's talking about of rationalism and irrationalism fighting within your own personality. And you are trying to assert a rational view of things that keeps it in control for you and is comfortable for you. And that is just as much a problem of autonomy as when we're describing it on the social level with LGBTs and all that, everything else. It's true in science, it's true in ethics and government, it's true in courts, okay? Take these two aspects in a court of law. What's going on in a court of law? You have two things. Every court case comes down to two things: the law and the facts. Okay, that is the rational and the irrational. That is the one and the many. In the worldview Van Til just described, and there will always be a discussion of those two things. There will always be an attempt to get at what the facts actually are. I should say what the relevant facts actually are. And then we'll compare that to what the law says. And if those things harmonize in such a way to show that the set of facts infracted the law, transgressed the law, then there will be sanctions and punishments for that, or some kind of address of it. If we find out that it harmonized with the law, it's perfectly legal, well then fine, we move on to what the next step is. It's that same struggle between what is rational and what is irrational. So when that is done within the understanding of God's created order, we have to bring his laws into it as well, with the understanding that he exists. It's for his glory. The heavens declare this to us. And when we submit to him, then we bring in the rest of his revelation. And we start submitting to it as well, studying it, learning it, understanding it. If you go back to Psalm 19, and I should probably bear this out in more detail when I have more time. Well, of course, we will when we get there. He has that first several verses, 6 or 7 verses, in which he says the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament declares his handiwork. Okay, right, there's this focus upon creation and God's special revelation, or God's general revelation to us in creation. And then the next verses, he completely pivots, and he says, the law of the Lord is perfect. And he starts talking about the law. Okay, so you see how the acceptance of the one naturally is going to lead into the other one. And they're a package deal, because God is one and his law order is one. And when you have a biblical worldview, you can't think like a pagan. You can't do court like a pagan. You can't, as I wrote an article the other day, you can't fly an airplane like a pagan. There's only one way to do that, and that is within God's created universe. And when you acknowledge that, you acknowledge the whole package. So that brings in the whole issue of ethics. And as I said earlier, mankind's problem is not a lack of knowledge. It is a lack of ethical knowledge. It's a lack of ethical integrity and submission to him. I almost forgot. I did want to share with you something I promised before, and that is a little excerpt from a theologian named Screwtape. You may recognize that name, of course, from the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. He is a fictional character, a demon in kind of the hierarchy of demons, and he is writing letters to a junior demon, instructing him on how best to carry out whatever it is that demons do in order to try to thwart the human race, carry out the agenda of the enemy. And in fact, when he refers to the enemy in this the little excerpt, that he's referring to humankind, mankind. And the elder, or kind of a senior bureaucrat demon, and this book by Lewis is brilliant in that it's filled with not only all kinds of religious insights, but also something like a tremendous background in how bureaucracy works, and there's this kind of clever wisdom that goes along with it. Anyway, what is said here in chapter 7 of the Screwtape Letters is perfectly in accord with what I was just reading from Van Til in regarding to the rational and the irrational, and how those work together as part of the agenda of the enemy. And when you see this, I think when you hear this, you will get an even better picture. And so Screwtape writes, "Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves." Now, of course, this has not always been so. We're really faced with a cruel dilemma. When the humans disbelieve in our existence, we lose all the pleasing results of direct terrorism, and we make no magicians. On the other hand, when they believe in us, we cannot make them materialists and skeptics, at least not yet. I have great hopes that we shall learn in due time how to emotionalize and mythologize their science to such an extent that what is in effect a belief in us, though not under that name, will creep in while the human mind remains closed to belief in the enemy, which of course is God ultimately. The life force, the worship of sex, of some aspects of psychoanalysis may here prove useful, if once we can produce our perfect work, the materialist magician. The man, not using but veritably worshiping what he vaguely calls forces while denying the existence of spirits, then the end of the war will be in sight. That was Screwtape's advice to, in part, to, I believe Wormwood was the name of the second demon. And it's perfectly in accord with what we just studied from Van Til in terms of human autonomy. Now keep in mind, C.S. Lewis is writing this during World War II era. Van Til doesn't write his stuff until 1955 in a completely different academic setting. I'm not sure the two ever even talked to each other. So that they have the same insight that coalesces like this is just brilliant. And what Screwtape is describing is how we can create a man in which his rational side and his irrational side, science as he calls it, and magic come together and coalesce in such a way that we have this fully autonomous human being, and that is in opposition to the enemy, God's worldview. So I hope that kind of ties it together a little bit better, what Van Til was saying and what we've been saying in regard to the creator-creation distinction, the personalism of God, the revelation of God, and all of those things. And so we'll stop there with that. And until the next time, this is The Devoted Word, and I'm Joel McDermott, brought to you by the American Vision. Please visit us at americanvision.org. Remember to like and subscribe, and to consider becoming a monthly supporter of this ministry. And as always, we thank you very much.